The frost had already taken 3 of her fingers by the time anyone found her. She was 40 feet from the fire, alone, wrapped in a hide that hadn't been enough. The rest of the group survived the night without incident because they hadn't slept the way she had. They'd slept in a pile. Nobody could explain, at the time, why that single choice was the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. For most people, the image of early humans sleeping together conjures something simple. Primitive people, huddled for warmth, the way you'd bundle up in a sleeping bag on a cold campout. That's the story we've inherited, mostly from museum dioramas and nature documentaries. Cavemen in a heap around a fire, teeth chattering, waiting for sunrise. It's a tidy explanation, and it isn't wrong exactly. Thermoregulation was real. Losing body heat in the open in the last ice age could kill you in a matter of hours. But that explanation was built for a modern audience that already believes sleep is supposed to be a solitary act, something you do in a private room, behind a closed door, ideally alone. So when we look backward at communal sleeping, we assume it was a workaround, a temporary inconvenience our ancestors endured until they invented something better. Privacy, beds, walls. The assumption baked into that story is that solitary sleep is the default setting for a human being, and group sleep was the primitive detour. Anthropologists who've actually lived alongside surviving hunter-gatherer societies will tell you that assumption is almost exactly backward, and that the real function of the sleeping pile had almost nothing to do with staying warm. Start with the San people of the Kalahari and the Hadza of northern Tanzania, 2 of the last remaining foraging societies whose sleep patterns have been directly studied by modern researchers. In 2015, sleep scientist Jerome Siegel and his team at UCLA fitted members of both groups, along with the Tsimane of Bolivia, with wrist monitors to track their actual sleep cycles. What they found didn't match the primitive insomnia myth at all. These groups slept in tight clusters, multiple generations to a fire, and their sleep was neither longer nor more broken than the average American's. But it was different in one specific way. Someone was always, statistically, awake, not because of insomnia, because sleep in these societies functions like a rotating watch. At any given hour of the night, across a sleeping group of 10 to 15 people, at least one person's brain is in a lighter sleep stage, primed to notice sound, movement, or smell. That's the part most people never hear. The pile wasn't a huddle. It was a sensor array. Go back further, and the picture gets stranger. Fossil and cave site evidence from Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, the same site where Neanderthal remains were first excavated in the 1950s by Ralph Solecki, shows sleeping hollows arranged in clusters near the cave mouth, angled so that the group's line of sight covered the entrance from multiple points. Nobody was sleeping in the back, alone, in the dark. The most vulnerable position in a Paleolithic sleeping arrangement wasn't the edge closest to the cold. It was the edge closest to nothing, the spot with no one on one side and no line of sight to the entrance. Skeletal trauma patterns found at several Pleistocene-era sites, bite marks consistent with hyena and large cat predation, found disproportionately on individuals believed to have been positioned at the periphery, suggest predators learned the same lesson humans did. The edge of the pile was the kill zone. But here's where it gets darker. This wasn't just physical vulnerability. It was social. In small foraging bands, sleeping apart from the group didn't just mean less protection. It meant something had gone wrong between you and the group. Ethnographic accounts of the Ashe of Paraguay, recorded by anthropologists Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado starting in the 1980s, describe individuals who slept apart from the main fire as ones who had been shamed, exiled, or were dying. Sleeping alone was the visible marker of social death, sometimes preceding literal death by only days. That pattern didn't disappear when humans built houses. It just changed shape. In early modern Europe, Historian A. Roger E. Kirch's research, laid out in his 2005 book, At Day's Close, Night in Times Past, reconstructed something almost nobody in the modern world remembers. Pre-industrial households didn't sleep in a single unbroken block. They slept in two segments, a first sleep and a second sleep, with an hour or two of quiet wakefulness in between, used for prayer, conversation, sex, or simply lying in the dark with whoever shared your bed, because almost nobody slept alone. Servants slept with servants. Travelers shared beds with strangers at inns as a matter of routine, not desperation. Entire families, sometimes 3 generations, shared one bed frame, one mattress, one blanket. Sleeping alone in early modern England or colonial New England wasn't a luxury. It was a hardship reserved for the friendless, the excommunicated, and the very poor. And increasingly, by the 1700s, it was becoming something else entirely. A punishment built on purpose. By the mid-18th century, a new kind of institution had started appearing across London and its outskirts. Buildings meant to hold the children nobody else could, or would. Thomas Coram opened the Foundling Hospital in 1741, taking in infants abandoned by mothers who had no other option. It was framed, publicly, as an act of mercy. And in one sense, it was. The alternative for many of these infants was the street, but mercy inside those walls had a specific architecture. Rows of cots, regulated feeding times, minimal handling, because handling took staff time the institution didn't have. Infants who, for the entire span of human history before this point, would have slept against a body, a mother, a sibling, a stranger in the same bed, were now sleeping in a cot, alone, in a row of identical cots, in a silent room. Nobody in 1741 thought this arrangement might be dangerous. It looked, on paper, like an improvement. Clean, orderly, efficient. The mortality records from the Foundling Hospital's early years tell a different story, and this is the part of the timeline that most retellings skip entirely. It would take almost 2 centuries before anyone connected the dots. And when they finally did, the explanation was so specific, so mechanical, that it changed how doctors understood infancy itself. In 1945, an Austrian-American psychoanalyst named René Spitz published a study that would quietly detonate everything institutions like the Foundling Hospital had assumed about caring for infants. Spitz had observed babies in a foundling home, well-fed, medically monitored, kept clean, but rarely held, because staff ratios made touch a luxury the schedule couldn't afford. He called what he documented hospitalism. Infants who received adequate nutrition and medical care, but almost no physical contact, began to decline. Not gradually. Some stopped growing. Some stopped responding to faces. Some, despite showing no infectious disease, simply died. Spitz's mortality figures from these institutions were high enough that they couldn't be explained by illness alone. The missing variable was touch, and specifically, the missing variable was another body in proximity through the night, the exact configuration humans had slept in for the entire span of our species until very recently. Slow down here, because this is the part that recontextualizes everything that came before it. The sleeping pile was never primarily about heat. It was never primarily about safety from predators either, though both of those were real benefits. The pile was a nervous system regulator. Human infants, and to a lesser extent human adults, do not fully develop stable heart rhythms, stress hormone regulation, and temperature control in true isolation. The body calibrates itself against another body. Sleeping alone doesn't just remove warmth and watchfulness. It removes a signal your nervous system was built, across hundreds of thousands of years, to expect. Take that signal away completely for long enough, in an infant whose systems haven't yet learned to self-regulate. And the body doesn't just feel lonely. It can start to fail. And here's the twist within the twist. The same institutions that discovered this, in some cases, kept doing it anyway. Psychologist Harry Harlow's 1958 experiments at the University of Wisconsin, in which infant rhesus monkeys were separated from their mothers and given a choice between a wire-feeding surrogate and a soft cloth surrogate that provided no food at all, showed that the monkeys overwhelmingly chose contact over sustenance, clinging to the cloth mother even while starving. Harlow's work was published, celebrated, cited for decades, and institutional childcare practices around the world, orphanages, some hospital maternity wards, some foster systems, continued to separate infants from physical contact as standard procedure for another 30 years after his results were public. The starkest confirmation came from Romania. After Nicolae Ceausescu's 1966 decree effectively banning contraception and abortion to boost the national population, tens of thousands of children ended up in state orphanages, many kept in cribs in near-total isolation, with staff ratios sometimes exceeding 20 infants per caregiver. When the regime fell in 1989 and Western researchers gained access, what they found became one of the most cited case studies in developmental psychology. Children with catastrophically delayed growth, cognitive impairment, and in the most severe cases, EEG scans showing measurably smaller brain volume, directly correlated to T. The Bucharest Early Intervention Project, launched in 2000 by psychiatrists Charles Ziana, Charles Nelson, and Nathan Fox, followed these children for over a decade and confirmed what Spitz had suggested and Harlow had demonstrated in monkeys 60 years earlier. Physical isolation during infancy leaves a measurable, sometimes permanent mark on the human brain. The Romanian orphanage findings became public through ABC News 2020 coverage in 1990, and a wave of subsequent medical journal publications through the 1990s and 2000s, eventually cited in reforms to institutional care standards across Eastern Europe and in U.S. adoption medicine training. But the underlying mechanism, that separation itself, not neglect or malnutrition, was doing the damage, took until the Bucharest Project's peer-reviewed results in the mid-2000s to be widely accepted in Western pediatric and psychiatric practice. For nearly 250 years, from Coram's Foundling Hospital to Ceausescu's orphanages, institutions built to protect abandoned children had been running an unintentional, uncontrolled experiment, confirming exactly what the earliest humans already knew instinctively. Nobody sleeps safely alone. Today, that same tension quietly plays out in millions of households, dressed up in gentler language. Sleep training methods that instruct parents to let an infant cry alone in a dark room, in a crib 40 feet, or 40 inches, from anyone else, are marketed as modern, evidence-based, an improvement on the primitive habit of co-sleeping. The vocabulary has flipped entirely. What was once framed as backward is now framed as best practice, and what once kept a body alive through a Paleolithic winter is now framed as a habit to be broken by 6 months old. Somewhere, in a nursery no different in principle from a cot at the Foundling Hospital, a small body is running the same ancient calibration it always has, waiting for a second heartbeat nearby that isn't always coming. The frost took her fingers because she was 40 feet from the fire. Some of us are still that far away. We just can't feel the cold the same way anymore.